They shoved a 90-year-old Marine into traffic, laughing like it was a joke. 20 minutes later, the alley they ran into was blocked by 8 silent Marines. And what happened next? Nobody's laughing now. If you believe respect isn't optional, hit subscribe and type Semper in the comments. Let's begin. Arthur Green wasn't the kind of guy who went looking for trouble. Hell, at 90 years old, trouble was about the last thing on his shopping list. But there's something you need to understand about Arthur, and I mean really understand, before this whole thing makes sense. Picture this: a man who walked with purpose, even when his body protested every step. That old wooden cane of his wasn't just for balance. It was like an extension of who he was. Sturdy, reliable, weathered by years but still doing its job. His service cap sat low over eyes that had seen things most people only read about in history. Books and that old Marine ring on his knuckle. It caught the light just right when he walked, like it was reminding the world of something important. Arthur was what you'd call a quiet man, but not the invisible kind of quiet. He was the kind who made eye contact when he passed you on the street. The kind who still straightened his shoulders when a flag went by, even when those shoulders ached from decades of carrying more than their share. You've met men like Arthur before, maybe at a family gathering or in line at the hardware store. They don't announce themselves with loud voices or fancy clothes, but somehow you just know there's steel under that weathered exterior. Every Friday, and I mean every single Friday for the past God knows how many years, Arthur made the same trek, 3 blocks from his small apartment to Murphy's Bakery on the corner of Elmont Street. Not for bread, not for coffee, for one eclair. Just one. A reward, he'd tell the baker with that slight smile of his, for still being on the right side of the dirt. It was such a simple thing, you know. An old man and his weekly treat, the kind of routine that gives life structure when everything else starts falling apart around you. Murphy knew to save him one of the good ones, the ones with the real cream. Inside, not that artificial stuff, it was their little arrangement, unspoken but understood. So there Arthur was, walking his familiar route that Tuesday afternoon. The weather was decent. Not too hot, not too cold. The kind of day that makes you think maybe the world isn't going completely to hell after all. He turned onto Elmont Street, already thinking about that eclair, when he saw them. 5 teenagers, maybe 17, 18 years old. The kind of kids who take up more space than they've earned, if you know what I mean. They'd spread themselves across the sidewalk like they'd bought stock in the concrete, laughing too loud at jokes that probably weren't that funny. But here's the thing, Arthur had dealt with kids like this before. You don't live in the same neighborhood for 30 years without learning when to walk around trouble. Except today, walking around wasn't an option. They'd positioned themselves right in front of the bakery entrance, legs stretched out, backpacks tossed everywhere, basically, turning the public sidewalk into their personal living room. And Arthur... well, Arthur had his Friday routine, and some punk kids weren't about to change that. He walked right up to them, didn't hesitate, didn't look for another route. Just walked up with that measured pace of his and stopped. "Excuse me, fellas," he said, and his voice had that particular quality you hear from men who've spent years giving orders and having them followed. Not harsh, not demanding, just certain. Mind making a little room for an old Marine, the leader of this little pack? And there's always a leader, isn't there? Looked up from whatever he was doing on his phone. Tall kid, probably thought he was hot stuff, with his cheap gold chain and his backward baseball cap that looked like it cost more than Arthur's weekly grocery budget. The kind of kid who'd never been told no in any way that actually stuck. The Yar's kid looked Arthur up and down like he was evaluating a piece of furniture at a garage sale. Then he snorted, actually snorted, like Arthur had just told the world's worst joke. Marine. The word came out dripping with mockery. What war? The Civil War. His buddies thought this was hilarious. They cracked up like their friend had just delivered the punchline of the century. You know, that particular kind of teenage laughter? The kind that's less about humor and more about proving how clever they think they are? That's what filled the air around Arthur as he stood there, still polite, still patient. Arthur's smile didn't waver. 90 years of living teaches you that. Getting angry at ignorance is like getting angry at the weather. It doesn't change anything, and it only makes you wet. Just trying to get by, son. Then maybe pick a different block, Grandpa. Now, Arthur could have done a lot of things in that moment. He could have explained that he'd been walking this route since before this kid was a twinkle in his daddy's eye. He could have mentioned that he'd earned the right to walk any damn sidewalk he pleased. He could have told them about Chosin Reservoir or Gaysan, or any number of places where real men had paid real prices for the freedom these kids were using to be jackasses on a Tuesday afternoon. Instead, Arthur took a step forward, intending to squeeze past them, just trying to get to the bakery, get his eclair, and go home to the peace and quiet of his small apartment where teenagers didn't exist. And the worst thing he had to deal with was the thermostat that never quite worked right. That's when it happened, the kid with the gold chain, and I wish I could tell you his name, but some stories are better when the villains stay faceless, stuck out his foot, not subtle about it, not accidental. Deliberate as a punch to the gut. Another kid, wearing a hoodie that probably cost more than Arthur's entire outfit, gave him a shove from behind. Not gentle, not playful. A real shove, the kind that sends a message. Arthur stumbled. Now, when you're 90 years old, stumbling isn't just embarrassing, it's dangerous. Arthur's old reflexes kicked in, the ones trained into him decades ago when quick reactions meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. He managed to catch himself with his cane, barely, but not before he'd stumbled off the high curb and into the street. Cars swerved, horns blared like angry geese. A blue sedan missed him by maybe 6 inches, the driver's face white with shock behind the windshield. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs, not from fear, but from something much older and much more dangerous. The kind of cold fury that comes from being disrespected by people who've never earned the right to disrespect anyone. The teenagers. They howled with laughter, not chuckles, not snickers, full-throated, belly-laughing, pointing and slapping each other laughter. One of them, a skinny kid with acne scars and dead eyes, even had the balls to mock salute Arthur as he struggled back onto the sidewalk. "Thanks for your service, old man," the kid called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And just like that, they scattered, sauntered off down a side alley like they were kings of the world, still chuckling about the old fool who'd nearly gotten flattened. Just another Tuesday afternoon. Just another elderly person they'd humiliated for sport. A woman rushed up to Arthur, middle-aged, kind eyes, the type who still believed in helping strangers. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice full of genuine concern. "Those horrible boys. Should I call someone?" Arthur adjusted his cap, brushed off his jacket, and gave her the kind of smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm fine, ma'am. Thank you for your kindness." But as she walked away, Arthur stood there on that sidewalk, his cane gripped tight in his weathered hands, and said something so quiet she probably didn't hear it. "They'll learn. One way or another, they'll learn." Then he reached into his jacket pocket for his phone. Not his smartphone. Arthur didn't trust those fancy devices with their cameras and apps and constant buzzing. This was an old flip phone, scratched and dented, missing the 5 key from when he dropped it 2 winters ago. But it still worked, and more importantly, it still had a number programmed into its simple memory, not the police. Arthur had been around long enough to know that by the time the cops showed up, those kids would be long gone, and all he'd have accomplished is filling out paperwork that would disappear into some filing cabinet. Not his nephew, the one who called. Twice a year, and always seemed in a hurry to hang up. No, Arthur scrolled to a contact he hadn't used in a long time, but had never deleted. Gunny Miller, USMC RS. You see, a couple of years back, Arthur had attended a Veterans of Foreign Wars event, one of those gatherings where old warriors come together to remember things they wish they could forget and forget things they wish they could remember. That's where he'd met Staff Sergeant Miller, though everyone called him Gunny, the way you do with Marines who've earned the respect that comes with the title. Miller was young, maybe 35, with the kind of squared-away appearance that screams Marine from 100 yards away. Sharp uniform, sharper mind, and the kind of loud voice that could wake the dead or motivate the unmotivated, depending on what the situation called for. But more than that, Miller had something that was getting rarer these days. He looked at old veterans like Arthur and sore warriors, not relics gathering dust in a corner. They'd talked that night, just for a few minutes, between the speeches and the ceremonial flag-folding. Miller had asked Arthur about Korea, really asked, like he wanted to understand something important. And Arthur, who rarely talked about those days, found himself sharing a story or two. Nothing dramatic, nothing Hollywood would want to make a movie about. Just the quiet kind of courage that happens when regular people find themselves in irregular circumstances. At the end of the evening, Miller had given Arthur his card. "You ever need anything, Master Gunny?" he'd said, using the shortened version of Arthur's old rank. "You call me. Day or night. Marines take care of Marines." Arthur had smiled and pocketed the card, thinking it was just the kind of thing young Marines say to old Marines, the way people say, "Let's have lunch," without ever meaning it. Turns out Miller meant every word. Arthur hit the call button and listened to it ring once, twice. Staff Sergeant Miller, Marine Corps Recruiting Station. "Gunny, it's Master Gunnery Sergeant Arthur Green, retired." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not confusion, but the kind of pause that happens when someone's entire world shifts gears in the space of a heartbeat. "Sir, what can I do for you?" Arthur explained it the way Marines explain things, with precision, without drama, just the facts in the order they happened. 5 teenagers outside Murphy's Bakery on Elmont Street, the blocked sidewalk, the mocking, the deliberate trip, the shove into traffic, the laughter as they disappeared into the alley behind the old packing plant. He didn't embellish, didn't make himself sound like a victim or them sound like monsters. Just laid out the situation like he was giving a field report to a commanding officer. When he finished, there was another pause. Then Miller's voice came back, and it had dropped about an octave, taken on a quality that Arthur recognized from his own days in command. The voice you use when something needs to be handled, and handled right now. "You okay, Master Gunny?" "I'm fine, Gunny, just bruised pride. But I figured you should know. There's some punk kids out here who think Marines are a joke." The sound that came through the phone wasn't quite a growl, but it wasn't conversation either. It was the sound of a well-oiled machine starting up, finding its rhythm, preparing to do what it was designed to do. Location? Back alley off Elmont. Dead end behind the old Hartman Packing Company. "You know the one?" "I do." "How many?" 5 of them. 17 to 19 years old, I'd guess. Ringleader's got a gold chain and a backwards cap. Understood. Arthur could hear things happening in the background, boots moving across a floor, a chair scraping, someone barking an order that got cut off mid-sentence. The sound of the Marine. "Core machinery, clicking into gear. We'll take care of it, Master Gunny. Core style." "Not looking for violence, Gunny," Arthur said, though part of him, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be 25 and bulletproof, wouldn't have minded seeing these kids learn some lessons the hard way. "Just want them to understand respect." "You got it, sir. Consider it handled." The line went dead. Arthur folded his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he walked over to a bench that had a clear view of the alley entrance, sat down and settled in to wait. He didn't have to wait long. 10 minutes. That's all it took. First came the sound, the low rumble of heavy engines that announced themselves, without apology. Then came the vehicles, 3 black Suburbans, the kind of government-issued transportation that makes people stop and wonder what's happening. Not police cars, not fire trucks. Something else entirely. The vehicles pulled up with the kind of precision you see in military convoys, each one positioned perfectly to control the area around the alley entrance. And then the doors opened. Marines. Not in combat gear. This wasn't Fallujah. Not in dress blues. This wasn't a ceremony. They were wearing a mix of service uniforms and utilities, the everyday working clothes of Marines who'd been pulled from whatever they were doing and told to handle a situation. But it didn't matter what they were wearing, the way they moved, the way they carried themselves, the way they seemed to make the very air around them stand at attention. That told you everything you needed to know. 8 of them total, led by Gunny Miller himself. Arthur recognized him immediately, even from across the street. Same squared shoulders, same purposeful stride, same aura of controlled authority that made you understand why some people were born to lead and others were born to follow. They didn't run. Marines don't run unless someone's shooting at them or there's a chow line about to close. They moved with the kind of measured urgency that covers ground fast without looking hurried. Like wolves who've caught a scent and know exactly where. It's leading them. 2 Marines positioned themselves at the mouth of the alley, not blocking it exactly, just standing there, making their presence known, making it clear that whatever was about to happen in that alley, nobody was leaving until it was finished. The other 6, with Gunny Miller at the point, turned and disappeared into the dim throat of the alley like shadows with purpose. Arthur sat on his bench and waited. He couldn't see what was happening back there, but he didn't need to. He could imagine it well enough. 5 punk kids who thought they were tough, suddenly finding themselves face to face with 8 Marines who knew exactly what tough actually looked like. The teenagers had been back there for about 20 minutes by now, probably still congratulating themselves on their clever little prank. Maybe sharing stories about other old people they'd hassled, maybe planning their next bit of entertainment. Arthur could picture them, sprawled against the brick walls, passing around a vape pen, talking too loud because silence made them nervous. That silence was about to get a lot more uncomfortable. From his bench, Arthur couldn't make out individual words, but he could hear the change. The sudden, absolute cessation of teenage chatter and laughter, the kind of silence that falls when prey animals realize they're not alone in the woods anymore. Then came Gunny Miller's voice. Arthur had heard that voice before, at the VFW event when Miller was telling stories and sharing laughs with the older vets. It had been warm then, friendly, the voice of a young man who genuinely respected his elders and understood the weight of the sacrifices they'd made. This wasn't that voice. This was the voice Miller used when he needed to transform civilians into Marines, when he needed to break down everything someone thought they knew about themselves and rebuild it into something stronger. This was the voice that could strip paint from walls and make grown men question every choice they'd ever made. Arthur couldn't make out the words, but he didn't need to. He knew the tone, knew the cadence, knew the effect it was having on those 5 kids who'd thought they were so clever 20 minutes ago. It was the sound of authority meeting arrogance, of consequence catching up with choices, of respect being explained to people who'd never been taught its value. No yelling. Marines don't need to yell when they really mean business. Just that. Steady, relentless, ice-cold delivery that cuts through excuses and bravado like a blade through butter. Every word carefully chosen. Every sentence building on the last, creating a wall of understanding that those kids couldn't climb over, couldn't go around, couldn't pretend didn't exist. Arthur heard another voice join Miller's, a female Marine, her tone like shattered glass, sharp enough to cut and strong enough to leave scars. Then another voice, and another, not all talking at once, not chaos, but a systematic, methodical lesson in respect that those kids would remember for the rest of their lives. The counseling session because that's what this was really, just a very particular kind of counseling. Lasted maybe 6 or 7 minutes, long enough to make the point, not so long that it became torture. Just enough time to explain some fundamental truths about respect, about consequences, about what happens when you mess with people who've earned better treatment than you're capable of giving. Then the voices stopped. Arthur waited, watching the alley entrance like a cat watching a mouse hole, and then they came out, the teenagers first, one by one, looking like they'd seen the face of God and discovered he wasn't nearly as understanding as their Sunday school teachers had led them to believe. Gone was the swagger, the arrogance, the casual cruelty that had marked them as predators just a half-hour earlier. They moved like sleepwalkers, pale and shaken, eyes fixed on the ground in front of their feet. The kid with the gold chain, the ringleader who'd thought shoving an old man was hilarious, looked like he'd aged 5 years. In 5 minutes. His chain was still there, but it seemed smaller somehow, less significant. His backward cap was gone entirely, probably confiscated as evidence of his stupidity. He kept touching his chest like he was checking to make sure his heart was still beating. They didn't run. Running would have required more energy than they currently possessed, and besides, running would have been disrespectful, and they'd just received a very thorough education on the subject of respect. They walked, slowly, carefully, like people navigating a minefield in the dark, and as they passed Arthur's bench, something extraordinary happened. One of them, not the leader, one of the followers, a kid who probably hadn't said more than 3 words during the whole encounter at the bakery, stopped. He looked up from the pavement, made eye contact with Arthur for the first time, and, in a voice barely above a whisper, said, "I didn't know, sir. I'm sorry." Arthur studied the kid's face, saw genuine remorse there, the kind that comes from understanding rather than just fear. Saw a 17-year-old boy who'd just learned something important about the world and his place in it. Arthur gave him a single nod, just one, but it was enough. The kid rejoined his group, and they continued their slow exodus from the scene of their education. Arthur watched them go, noting how they gave wide berth to every elderly person they passed, how they stepped aside to let others use the sidewalk, how they'd been transformed from predators to something approaching civilized human beings in the space of one conversation. Then came the Marines. Gunny Miller emerged from the alley first, his uniform still crisp, his bearing still perfect, but with something in his expression that spoke of satisfaction at a job well done. Behind him came his team, falling into formation without being told, moving with the same disciplined precision that had brought them here. Miller spotted Arthur on the bench and changed direction, his Marines adjusting their course like a school of fish following their leader. When he reached Arthur, Miller stopped and snapped into a salute so crisp it could have cut glass. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Green, sir. The situation has been addressed." Arthur rose from the bench, not as fast as he once could, but with dignity, intact, and returned the salute. His old muscles remembered the motion, remembered the meaning behind it, remembered what it felt like to be part of something bigger than himself. Gunny Miller. I witnessed the whole thing. Miller's expression softened just a fraction, the way it does when Marines talk to other Marines and the formal protocols give way to something more personal. "They'll remember this day for the rest of their lives, sir. Guaranteed." Arthur allowed himself a small smile. That was the idea. Then something happened that Arthur hadn't expected, something that reminded him why he'd loved the Corps so much, and why leaving it had been one of the hardest things he'd ever done. One of the younger Marines, barely out of boot camp from the look of him, still carrying himself like he was afraid someone might discover he wasn't really supposed to be there, stepped out of formation. Not far, just a single pace, but enough to draw attention. The young Marine reached into his breast pocket and pulled out something small and carefully folded. An American flag. Not the big one that flies over courthouses and schools, but the kind that fits in a wallet or a book, the kind servicemen carry when they're far from home and need to remember what they're fighting for. He held it out to Arthur, his voice quiet but steady. "With respect, sir, from one Marine to another." Arthur looked down at the flag, then up at the young Marine's face, saw earnestness there and respect, and the kind of unquestioning honor that made old men like Arthur believe that maybe, just maybe, the country they'd bled for was going to be all right after all. Arthur's fingers trembled, not from age this time, but from the weight of the moment, the unexpected gift of recognition from someone who understood what the uniform meant, what the service meant, what the sacrifice meant. "Thank you, son," Arthur said, his voice rougher than usual. Then, because some words carry more weight than others, he added, "Semper Fi." The young Marine's face lit up like Arthur had just handed him the Medal of Honor. He snapped to attention and delivered a salute that would have made his drill instructors weep with pride. Arthur returned it, and for a moment the years fell away. He wasn't a 90-year-old man with arthritis and a cane. He was a Marine, standing with other Marines, connected by something that time and age couldn't touch. Gunny Miller watched the exchange with approval, then turned back to his team. "Company, march!" The command wasn't shouted. It didn't have to be. Miller's Marines formed up in perfect order and began to move, their synchronized footsteps creating a rhythm that echoed off the buildings around them. Not marching to make a show, not marching because someone told them to, but marching because they were Marines, and that's what Marines do. The sound filled the street like a heartbeat, steady and strong and unmistakable. Every step was a statement. We remember, we protect, we don't let disrespect slide. People had started gathering to watch. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like this, and the sight of 8 Marines conducting business on Elmont Street was the kind of thing that brought folks out of their houses and shops. They lined the sidewalks now, some with phones out, some with hands over hearts, all of them understanding that they were witnessing something important, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on what. As the Marines passed, something beautiful happened. A few people started clapping, then a few more, then everyone. Not the kind of applause you hear at football games or concerts, but the deeper kind, the kind that comes from respect and gratitude, and the recognition that some people put their lives on the line so that others can live in peace. Arthur stood in the middle of it all, that folded flag still in his weathered hands, tears tracking down the lines on his face without shame or apology. Because in a world that moved too fast, that forgot too easily, that treated respect like it was optional, someone had remembered. The Corps had remembered. The applause faded as the Marines disappeared around the corner, heading back to their recruiting station, where they'd file their reports and return to the business of turning civilians into warriors. But the feeling lingered, hanging in the air like the echo of a bugle call. Arthur walked home slowly, taking his time, savoring the weight of the flag in his pocket and the straightness in his spine that hadn't been there an hour ago. He passed Murphy's Bakery. The eclair could wait until next Friday. Today had provided all the sweetness he needed. That evening, Arthur sat in his small apartment, looking at the flag the young Marine had given him. He placed it carefully on the shelf, next to his other mementos, right between a faded photograph of his old unit and the shadow box that held his service ribbons. It fit perfectly, like it had always belonged there. He made himself a simple dinner, watched the news, went through the familiar routines that structured his days. But something felt different. When he looked in the bathroom mirror before bed, the face looking back at him didn't look tired or forgotten or irrelevant. It looked like a Marine. The story spread faster than Arthur could have imagined. In the age of social media and cell phone cameras, news travels at the speed of light, and the sight of 8 Marines dispensing justice in an alley was exactly the kind of content that people couldn't wait to share. Someone's security camera had caught the aftermath, The Marines emerging from the alley in formation, the transformed teenagers walking away like whipped dogs, the salute exchange between Arthur and Gunny Miller. The video didn't need sound. The visuals alone told the story. Respect given, respect received, justice served. It went viral within hours. Marines teach punks a lesson in respect, read one headline. Don't mess with the Corps, read another. The comment sections filled up with approval, with similar stories, with people sharing their own experiences of military justice delivered swiftly and decisively. But Arthur didn't know about any of that. He didn't have social media accounts or smartphones or any interest in internet fame. He just went about his business same as always. Same apartment, same routines, same quiet life punctuated by walks to the park and visits to the library. Except now, something was different. People noticed him, not in a celebrity way, not with cameras and autograph requests, but in the way that matters more. Store clerks made eye contact and smiled. Other elderly residents of his building stopped to chat in the hallway. Kids on the street stepped aside respectfully instead of barreling past like he was invisible. Word had gotten around the neighborhood the way word does in tight communities. Everyone knew about the old Marine who'd called in reinforcements, about the teenagers who'd gotten their comeuppance, about the reminder that respect wasn't optional just because someone was old or vulnerable. A week passed quietly. Then, on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after the incident, Arthur's doorbell rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. His nephew wasn't due for his semi-annual duty call for another 3 months, and the mailman never needed signatures for his simple life. Arthur opened the door cautiously, the way old people do when the world has taught them to be careful. Standing on his doorstep was the young Marine who had given him the flag. But he wasn't alone this time. Behind him stood 4 other Marines, all young, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else, but also like they wouldn't dream of being anywhere else. They were clean-cut and polite, with the kind of nervous energy that comes from meeting someone you've heard stories about. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Green, sir," the young Marine said, his voice respectful but friendly. "We were hoping... Well, we were wondering if you might have some time to talk. About Korea, about what it was like back then, about how you handled, and things when respect wasn't given but had to be earned." Arthur blinked, surprised. He'd been living quietly for so long that the idea of anyone wanting to hear his stories seemed almost foreign. But looking at these young faces, seeing the genuine interest there, the real desire to learn something important. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let them pass. "I'll make coffee." They crowded into his small living room, sitting on his worn couch and mismatched chairs, making the space feel more alive than it had in years. Arthur bustled around his kitchen, preparing coffee with the kind of care he usually reserved for special occasions, because somehow this felt like one. When he returned with the coffee, they were looking at his shelf of mementos with the kind of respectful curiosity that young soldiers show when they're in the presence of history, not touching anything, not asking for explanations, just absorbing the weight of a lifetime of service. "So," Arthur said, settling into his favorite chair. With his own cup, "What would you like to know?" And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Arthur talked, really talked. Not the polite small talk he exchanged with clerks and neighbors, but the kind of deep, meaningful conversation that happens between people who understand. Something important about duty and sacrifice and what it means to serve something bigger than yourself. He told them about Korea, about the cold that got into your bones and never left, about friends who didn't make it home and friends who made it home but left pieces of themselves behind. He told them about the discipline that kept you alive when everything else fell apart, about the brotherhood that sustained you when you were too tired and too scared and too far from home to sustain yourself. They listened like it mattered. Because it did. Every story, every detail, every quiet moment of courage that had never made it into history books or Hollywood movies. It all mattered to these young Marines who were just beginning to understand what they'd signed up for, what legacy they were inheriting, what responsibility they were accepting. By the time they left, it was getting dark outside. One of them, a lance corporal with serious eyes and a Wisconsin accent, asked if they could come back next week. Arthur smiled, feeling something warm settle in his chest. "I'll make cookies." They laughed, saluted, and filed out into the evening, leaving Arthur alone in his apartment that somehow felt less empty than it had before. They came back the next week, and the week after that, and so began something more powerful than revenge, more lasting than viral justice, more meaningful than any punishment those teenagers could have received. Legacy. Arthur had lived through war and loss and disrespect. He'd survived decades of feeling invisible, irrelevant, forgotten by a world that moved too fast to remember the sacrifices that had bought its freedom. But now, in what might have been the final chapter of his long life, something sacred had returned. The chain of honor was still unbroken, the stories were still being told, the lessons were still being learned, and that was enough, more than enough. Actually, it was everything. They thought he was just an old man taking up space on their sidewalk. They thought respect was something you could skip when it was inconvenient, something that expired when people got old or weak or different from you. But Arthur Green reminded them, and reminded all of us, that the Marine Corps doesn't forget its own. Not at 90, not ever. If this story moved you, share it right now. Because somewhere out there, another veteran is walking past a group of kids who've never been taught what respect means. And maybe, just maybe, this story is the lesson. They need hit that like button if you believe honor doesn't age. Drop a comment telling us about a veteran who made a difference in your life, and don't miss what's coming next. Another story that proves you don't earn respect by demanding it. You earn it by living it. We'll see you there.